A challenge to development would just be inequality, I guess, especially poverty, just because then you don't really have a chance at like the good life, and then there's sort of just a disharmony within society.
Laws, maybe, people not cooperating in a group, financial reasons, educational level.
People, mostly people. I think people get in the way of doing good things. There's good things and there's good people, but enough bad people are in power so you can't get through anything. So people and money, because money does bad stuff sometimes. So people and money.
We think of development as trying to develop places or countries or economies or parts of countries. A lot of older models of development thought they had the answer beforehand. They thought there was one model of developing, that you had to industrialize or you had to develop big factories. And those models didn't necessarily work. They either didn't benefit enough people or they produced new kinds of problems which they didn't foresee.
Everybody thought that development was going to be a way to create social progress. The benefits of modernization, which we'd developed in the West, could be provided also for cultures around the world that didn't have the kinds of privileges and benefits that we in the West had. However, that was 60 years ago.
The inequality of power that people have is a huge obstacle that gets in the way of their having a chance to have their say and to have their concerns taken into account.
There used to be a sort of well-known theory that as you developed, first of all inequality increased, and then as you developed further it began to decrease. But what has been happening recently, which is in a way very depressing for those of us who think that inequality is a very bad thing, is that in developed countries inequality has begun increasing in a major way. It's fundamentally unjust, and it makes for a very unhealthy world in which some countries and some people are very poor and some are very rich. It tends to make for a conflictual world. It's not something which is at all desirable.
You can look at development either as expressing people's hopes or as expressing their fears. And so a lot of these development projects actually did do something to make people's lives better off. But on the other hand, as this whole process unfolded, as the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and all these other development banks did their work, it was found that some of their projects just didn't do what was expected. In fact, made people worse off. It kind of got clear that there were a number of values that distinguish good development from bad development. We should call it maldevelopment just if it does make people's lives worse. But, in what ways? Well, it could just be in absolute living standards. Maybe it just makes you poorer, but maybe someone else is getting the benefit from that and you're not. So, in these cases of these dams, we're talking about people having to resettle. It's a big deal, especially if your community is a poor one. Resettle in a totally different place. Dams go in, electricity gets produced. Who benefits from the electricity? Maybe it's big industries who get cheap power to make big profits, and maybe none of that gets back to the communities who took the risk. So there's an equality issue there. In most parts of the world, wherever you want to build something, there's someone who's already there. There's someone who's already living there. And they're going to have to be moved out of the way if the project is going to be completed. The last estimate was that 10 million people every year are displaced by infrastructure projects like roads and highways and airports being built.
What kinds of remedies can there be for this? Are we in the West the people to figure out the remedies? We didn't figure out how to do development right in the first place. Should we be the people to figure it out now? And if not, what should happen?
We have kind of opposed factions, the development banks are saying one thing, the people who are affected by this are saying something else, and is there something kind of in the middle that they all ought to be agreeing to about, what needs to be done for those people who are affected so they're not impoverished by the whole process?
Well, I think a lot of people that are involved with development ethics are aware of how many bad things happen in society because people who don't have opportunities are ignored or even controlled, or even worse, have their rights violated. So I think for me the key thing in development in our society in the United States, but in other societies around the world, is to be sure that the people who have less in the way of power are given more access to making decisions that will enable their own needs and aspirations to be taken into account.
In order to find solutions, or in order to sort of come up with ways of organizing economies or societies in a way that is beneficial to the people, you have to make sure that you're not imposing your own assumptions, and you have to sort of get a sense of how people want to live their own lives or organize their own communities. And so development then becomes a question about how one goes about that process of knowing about places rather than simply assuming that you know the solution. If you assume that you know the solutions without actually asking the people who live in the community or the country or the region which you're talking about, you may be imposing your own ideas. So sometimes it's a question of just listening to the communities because they understand their relationship to the land and they don't need to be told what it is. We need to listen to them and understand why they shouldn't be displaced. And so the conceptual tool maybe would be to continually rethink our concepts of development in a more sort of collaborative relationship with communities we're trying to help through development.
We in the United States are often unaware of the role that we play around the world in making decisions for other countries. The trick is that many of those countries are themselves not giving their own people the opportunity to be involved in decision making themselves, but are often countries run by a small elite. So in some sense we have to stay away. On the other hand, we can be important in giving those that don't have a voice an opportunity to have a bigger role in their own countries.
What has been sort of relatively good news is that in recent years, some countries, some developing countries, are showing falling inequality. It's not the very poor developing countries, but the slightly richer ones, some in Latin America, where they have had a whole lot of policies which have helped inequality, including transferring resources, giving cash basically to poor people, including raising the minimum wage so people earn reasonable wages when they work, and including extending education so people are in a position to earn good incomes when they leave school. So there has been some good news on that.
So a lot of things can be done. Yes, we academics can teach about it.
But there are many social groups already addressing these issues, and I'm sure in your own community you can find some of them. I think to find some of those movements yourself, whether it's a Sierra Club, an environmental movement, or working in local hospitals, there's lots of things that young people can do to contribute to development projects here as well as around the world.
Spending time in another culture, learning another language, seeing the joys and the sorrows of people. Sometimes they're the same as one's own, sometimes they're very different. And recognizing that one has, especially in a prosperous country, often a lot of advantages and a lot of benefits. And not recognizing that sometimes those benefits and advantages come from other people in other countries. I think to understand their situation helps us understand how lucky we are. It also gives us some sense of responsibility to help others.
The message I would give to teenagers is to also to think about a lot of the kids who are also killed by drone attacks, and to to also ask ourselves which kids we focus on when they die, and to focus on all the kids who are killed. There were also kids who were being killed just simply for living in the wrong village, because it was designated as a place where militants supposedly were. And so I would encourage teenagers to think about death more broadly, the deaths that are actually happening more broadly.
I think both social and public institutions are actually fundamental for the achievement of development, that you can't envisage it without these institutions. Some public institutions lack capacity. They basically don't have good people running them, they don't have sufficient education, they are very weak in terms of capacity. So public institutions really have some severe weaknesses, but that's not to say that there aren't some very effective public institutions, and also not to say that they're not critically important. You can't have really good development without good public institutions.
Where are the countries that have the highest standard of living? The Scandinavian countries. How have they achieved? They've got, free public health, great public education. So how did that come about? Well, it's because organizations like labor organizations, like women's organizations, like farmers' organizations, and other groups of citizens have actually agitated and organized for this. It really requires that people, that the societies and the communities themselves have to have some organization. So you have to have people who are organized for the sake of justice.
In a recent book by Duncan Green, he argues that what you need is effective government, and he also says active citizens, by which he means people who demand things of the government and push them into operating well. And I would add to that not just active citizens, but active pressure groups, active collectives, social movements who can try and insist that the government operates in an effective way. So I think you must have effective government, and you must have good, active contribution from groups and from citizens.